Hello, I'm Corinne from CorinneWorsley.com, and today I would like to ask you, how self-compassionate are you? Now, some of you may well already be aware of the importance of self-compassion for living a happy and fulfilled life, and you may already integrate this into your life. Others of you might be thinking, self-compassion, I don't need self-compassion, I need a good kick up the bum. I would definitely have fallen into that second category up until a few years ago, and if I'm honest, I do still fall into that second category on a pretty regular basis. But I do try and pull myself out of it by remembering how important self-compassion is. So let's start by looking at what self-compassion actually is. So Dr. Corinne Xx has done a huge amount of work on this. This is her specialist topic, and she has a book all about it that you can get your hands on called Self-Compassion. And in that book, she talks about the three elements that make up self-compassion. So one of those is self-kindness, the other is common humanity, and the third is mindfulness. So, self-kindness. This is about being nice to ourselves when things maybe don't go our way. Being nice to ourselves and compassionate towards ourselves when we fail or when we're just having a pretty tough time of it in general. Instead of beating ourselves around the head and being really hard on ourselves when we haven't performed as well as we would have liked to. And then common humanity. This is about understanding that everybody experiences the same feelings when they fail, when things don't go their way. Very, very few people are completely immune from feelings of being a failure or disappointment. So common humanity just reminds us that this is a collective experience, that everybody experiences these feelings and it's completely normal. And finally, mindfulness. So mindfulness is about recognizing the negative emotions when things don't really go as well as we would have liked them to, identifying them, but not over-identifying with them. So an example of this might be the difference between I failed and I am a failure. So if we failed at something, for instance, maybe an exam, and we say I failed, then there's no tie-in really with our self-worth and who we are as a human being in relation to that particular exam result. Whereas if we go down the road of I am a failure, then that's much more tied in with our self-worth, and it's a much more definitive way of thinking. So there's very little room there for growth and for changing things the next time around. By saying you are a failure, then you really are committing yourself to a lifetime of misery, basically. And that's the difference between identifying the negative emotions and acknowledging them, but not really over-identifying with them. So not making them not allowing them to define who we are and how we live our life. So why is self-compassion so important for us to be able to live a happy and fulfilled life? Well, at this point, I'd like to share a quote with you from Louise Hay, which is, "You've been criticizing yourself for years and it hasn't worked. Try approving of yourself and see what happens." Now, I love this quote. It really resonates for me because as a perfectionist, I'm sure there are some perfectionists out there watching this video, nothing that I ever do is good enough. Nothing I ever do meets my standards. And then what happens when I don't quite measure up to the standards that I'm trying to reach, and I very, very rarely pat myself on the back or congratulate myself for achieving something, for even if it's just a small step in the right direction, I very rarely recognize those steps in the right direction. It means that I'm disproportionately putting attention on the things that aren't going quite so well, as opposed to recognizing how much progress I'm making. And what this leads to is just an endless barrage of self-criticism that doesn't really work, if I'm honest. So yes, I have achieved a lot in my lifetime. I am an achiever, but that achievement has come without much enjoyment, if I'm honest, and perhaps you can relate to this yourself. Perhaps it's always just on to the next, on to the next, on to the next, and always wishing you'd done maybe a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, and perhaps even tying your self-worth into how much you achieve, which is what's pushing you to keep on striving and striving and not stopping to smell the roses, so to speak, on this journey of life. So where self-compassion becomes really useful, in my opinion, is in just stopping with the criticism and trying a different way. So how would it be if I was compassionate with myself when things didn't quite go to plan? How different would my experience be? How different would my response be to the pressure that I'm putting on myself? So would I break free finally from the cycles of having to achieve and then almost self-destructing and then going into the cycle of achievement again and then pressing self-destruct? Perhaps if I were more self-compassionate, I would instead find myself making more progress, which seems counterintuitive. So if you're anything like me, you may well be thinking, well, if I'm self-compassionate, if I show compassion towards myself, doesn't that mean that rather than striving, rather than trying to achieve, I'm just going to end up sitting on the sofa all day, doing nothing and achieving nothing and making no progress and becoming disappointed in myself? Well, no, is the answer. And let me just ask you, when you are putting pressure on yourself, when you're being really hard on yourself, how often do you find yourself actually almost rebelling against that and sitting on the sofa, doing nothing, procrastinating because you've got so much to do, you've taken on so much and you want to do it all perfectly that you just don't know where to start? Or you do really, really well and you get to a certain point and inevitably you have a little wobble, a little slip up, and instead of being self-compassionate and saying, that's okay, it's normal, everybody has these little moments of just figuring out what's next, these little moments where they perhaps slip up slightly. Instead of doing that, you beat yourself around the head, you catastrophize, and perhaps send yourself slipping back down the slope to where you started and having to start all over again. I know I certainly go through that cycle with, say, my fitness and nutrition journey. You know, I'll be doing really, really, really well, as in going for perfect, and then we'll fall off the wagon, catastrophize, and instead of just letting it be a minor slip up and having compassion for myself and then just getting going again, that kind of minor slip up turns into a major slip up and I end up right back where I started, beating myself up and having to do all the hard work all over again. And when I thought about this in terms of how other people treat me, that's when it really started to click for me. So when I worked in corporate, I realised that when people were kind to me, when they showed me compassion, when they treated me like a human being, I was far more inclined to work hard for them, to go the extra mile, and to want to perform well and to perform well. When somebody was really harsh on me, when somebody showed zero self-compassion, zero humanity, I had absolutely no desire to work hard for them. What I really wanted to do was punch them in the face. And that was not conducive to me being the best person that I could be and to performing as well as I could perform. Let me just add, I never did punch anybody in the face. But it really struck home for me that if that was the case when it came from other people, that somebody who was compassionate and kind towards me got the best out of me, then surely the same would apply with myself. So as I said, this is something that I still need to get to grips with, but I really do believe that figuring out how to be compassionate towards myself is part of what is going to change the cycle of achievement followed by self-sabotage, or achievement followed by zero reward whatsoever, and then eventually you run out of steam and you run out of desire to keep on going. So the things that get in the way of us being self-compassionate are over-identification with our failures and with the difficult things that we experience, being overly hard on ourselves, so judging ourselves really, really harshly. And what we find when we judge ourselves really, really harshly is that we're probably judging others by those standards as well. And then that becomes really stifling, whether it be in your family and people feel like nothing they ever do is good enough for you, or whether it be at work where you set these ridiculously high standards so people feel like they're going to fail no matter what they do. And finally, it's isolation. So if you feel like when you're in struggle, when you're experiencing difficulties, that nobody else ever experiences those, and therefore you're not willing to open up to show your vulnerability and to connect with others, then you'll feel really isolated, and that also feeds into a lack of self-compassion. So let's come back to the 3 things that are going to help you to cultivate self-compassion in your life. Self-kindness. Be kind to yourself when things maybe don't go quite to plan, when you fail, when you're having a tough time. Common humanity. Recognize that everybody else is going through similar things, and try to allow yourself to be a little bit vulnerable with people who it's safe to be vulnerable with, but just open up and show that you have tough times too, and then you'll find that you'll be able to connect more with the people around you. And lastly, mindfulness. So recognize you're going through something tough. Identify the emotions, but don't over-identify with them. Don't allow I failed to become I am a failure. So I would really love to hear how you get on with applying these principles of self-compassion and how this video has resonated with you. I'm certainly going to go away and finally read Dr. Neff's book that I have had on my shelf for many, many years, and see whether consciously cultivating self-compassion in my life can help to break some of the cycles and just make my experience a much more enjoyable and fulfilling experience. So I hope that was really helpful for you, and as always, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you would like to find out more about working with me, then you can get in touch via my contact page at www.corinneworsley.com, or you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, and I would love to hear from you. But for now, I wish you a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are, and I very much look forward to speaking to you again next week.